This is David Thompson once again with Behind the Lines, the Civil War Monitors online interview series with members of the Civil War community. Today I'm joined by Dr. Aaron Astor, the Associate Professor of History at Maryville College and author of Rebels on the Border, Civil War, Emancipation, and the Reconstruction of Kentucky and Missouri. And this is out by LSU Press. Astor, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Do you mind just sharing with us a little bit, kind of broad overview of what the book's actually about?
Sure. The book looks at the transformation of grassroots black and white politics at the heart of the Civil War's two most hotly contested border states, or slaveholding Union states, of Kentucky and Missouri. The book looks at, in particular, a political culture of conservative unionism, or pro-slavery unionism, that I argue was a pretty coherent set of practices and beliefs and symbols that had developed over decades and was particularly strong in Kentucky, in Missouri, particularly in central Kentucky, the bluegrass area around Lexington, and the central Missouri River Valley, known by various names, the Boone's Lick and later on the Little Dixie. What I argue is that as the war breaks out, you have this sort of dual rebellion against this conservative unionist order. You have white Confederates who rebel against the unionist part of conservative unionism. That's pretty well understood, I think. The motivations are not always well understood. But the other part of it is the role of slaves, who are, in essence, rebels against the conservative part of the conservative union. And these two, ironically, sort of work in tandem a bit and undermine the social order internally, to the point where by the time you get to 1864, coupled with guerrilla war and all sorts of troop movements through the states, you have really a collapse of the social order. And it's in the midst of that collapse that all of these folks have to kind of refashion a new kind of society, a new political culture in the midst of this. And African Americans is playing a very active role in their own emancipation, more so there, in fact, than anywhere else in the Union. They're not subject to the Emancipation Proclamation, for example. They are going to play a very, very strong role in the Reconstruction process. But once again, because these are loyal Union states, they're not subject to congressional radical Reconstruction. They have to sort of go through this process on their own with little guidance from the outside. What's interesting in looking at both of these two states is that there's a lot that differs. Missouri, the guerrilla war is a lot more intense there. The white-on-white violence is a lot more almost nihilistic at times, as where sadly recently passed Michael Feldman, who wrote brilliantly over 20 years ago in his book Inside War, really capturing the sort of psychology of people in the midst of Missouri's guerrilla war. Kentucky doesn't quite descend to that level, at least not until the very, very end of it. And as such, you get a kind of almost a radical Republican revenge against the old slaveholding elite in the latter part of the war in Missouri and into the post-war period. And in Kentucky, there's a rather seamless transition to bourbon democracy, to conservative democracy. And so in that context, it's going to look in many ways opposite to one another after the war. But what I argue is I take the story through 1870 into 1872, the first presidential election after the 15th Amendment, is that in both cases, you have this remaking of a white man's democracy, as they call it. I mean, the old Whigs, who are still very strong in both states, right up to 1861, join the Democratic Party. And, often with reluctance. They despised the old Jacksonian Democratic Party, but they have become Democrats now and seeing this, defining this on very, very explicitly racial terms. And so as far as African Americans, they have to, again, develop their own institutions, their own schools, benevolent organizations, in order to sustain their own vision of a biracial citizenship, of a biracial polity. And you get this very interesting notion of memory that develops there as well, where you get what I've called belated Confederates, these people who were essentially Unionists during the war and become, in a sense, almost ashamed, or they seem to devalue or put down in some way or another their Union's war service. Ann Marshall, who you're probably familiar with, has done a wonderful job of outlining this as a cultural phenomena, beginning around the point where my book ends and then taking it into the 20th century, and about this creating of a Confederate Kentucky. And she, I think, brilliantly analyzes all the nuances of that process. But and I think ultimately is that I think in order to really grasp the Civil War as a whole, we really need to look in the heartland of the country. We tend to view the Civil War as a battle of two very ideologically opposite societies, a free labor, capitalist, industrial North expanding to the West, a slave labor-based plantation staple crop South expanding to the West, fighting over that. What we don't realize is that really most of America lived in between those two places. And they lived in these, some of them were the so-called border states, Missouri, Maryland, Kentucky, Delaware, even West Virginia, which is kind of a strange case. But also in the upper parts of the Confederacy, Tennessee, North Carolina, Arkansas, and also southern Illinois, Indiana, Pennsylvania, Ohio, where you had slavery and union working in tandem for a very, very long period of time. And yes, there was certainly flare-ups, as Stanley Harold points out in his book Border Wars, that tended to have exaggerated implications. But really, there was an agreement of sorts along that kind of middle of the country. And they fought hard against the sort of centrifugal forces that were driving the nation into war. But as the war took hold, as we often see, it's in these middle grounds where the conflict gets the nastiest.
And I mean, you really, obviously, when focusing on Missouri and Kentucky, it's a very unique relationship these two states have with one another, or with two separate countries, really. Pragmatic is a word you use quite often, and I think that makes sense, particularly through April of 1861, and even really into invasion, so to speak, all right, in the fall of 61, particularly for Kentucky.
Correct.
Is there something that you found unique about Missouri and Kentucky that really sets it apart from the rest of the border South? Is there one element that you would really point to versus somewhere, say, like a Delaware?
Yeah, I think it's probably the westernness of them. I mean, this is a country that in 1860 views its future rightly as in the West. And the question, of course, many of the battles of the 1850s, well, really the 1840s beginning, are questions about the nature of the West. And, Kentucky really was the first West. I mean, Cumberland Gap was the great mass migration for white settlers from up as far north as Pennsylvania as the south as South Carolina, all funneling through Cumberland Gap into Kentucky and building this sort of Western culture. The Paris, Kentucky newspaper in Bourbon County is called the Western Citizen. There are a lot of places that identify themselves as Westerners. And what's interesting is that, a generation later, many of these same folks pick up and move, as I talk about, into Missouri. But many of them who didn't go to Missouri went to Indiana or Illinois, like Abe Lincoln, or, contrarily, went south to Texas, Mississippi, and so on, like John Bell Hood or Jefferson Davis. So it becomes, it's not just that it's in the border between North and South. It represents the future of the country in a way. And that, I think, is part of what makes it so contested. You add to that, in the Missouri case in particular, what makes it such a cauldron is a cauldron or a vortex of violence is the German immigrant population, which I don't think is quite as appreciated as needs to be. The numbers and the radical ideology of so many of these German immigrants who moved to Missouri, and not just to St. Louis, but to just on the south banks of the Missouri River, right across the river, literally, from the so-called Kingdom of Callaway, which was famously Confederate. And part of the intensity of the conflict there was that you had these Germans coming over who view these slaveholders across the river as just like the Prussian Junkers who they escaped, And then, of course, in reverse, you have these locals in Missouri who see these Germans as a bunch of Hessians, and they see them as illegitimate, immigrants here. And so you have those elements in Maryland, the immigration story. I wouldn't want to downplay those issues there, but in some ways, Kentucky, Missouri being Western oriented, I think. In some ways, this becomes not just a matter of fact, sort of unfolding of forces that have been there for so long, but rather a sense of where things could be. And these questions are still so much up for grabs as the whole nation is moving west.
And I think you point out, and rightly so, this is really an element, something that transcends classes. We're not talking about just elite whites that really are addressing this. This is something that kind of pervades all the class elements. Did that surprise you as you kind of went through this, or were you expecting that?
Well, what I found was that in terms of the different class orientations, it was what was more important was that conservative unionism as a general political culture had different manifestations for different classes and different partisan traditions, different urban versus rural, that kind of thing. If you look at, for example, Douglas supporters, many of them might have been Irish or German Catholic immigrants. They would have qualified in many ways as conservative unionists, but they would have been a different class than many of the old Merchant Bell supporters, many of the merchant class. Along the Missouri River Valley, or the head farmers around Lexington, Henry Clay, sort of his old folks there. It did transcend a lot of class. It did transcend class boundaries pretty significantly. And it's one of those things. It is almost by definition a sort of compromise position, a pragmatic compromise position that it would be hard for class divisions to manifest themselves in that context without, really complicating things. Now, after the war, it's a different story, because after the war, particularly in Missouri, it becomes, again, especially as the German immigration really, really picks up, you have some of the most intense labor conflicts. The St. Louis General Strike of 1877, for example. I mean, this becomes, David Thielen has talked about this in his book, Paths of Resistance, about you do get these intense class resistance in the Ozarks. Many of the poorer farmers in that area are going to be, less supportive of the expansive industrial capitalism, and even Jesse James, who I think T.J. Stiles is correct in interpreting him as a very, very politically minded robber. I mean, he is targeting what is seen as a Yankee version of industrial capitalism. And the railroad certainly helps with that. Kentucky's a little bit less, at least in the areas that I look at. Louisville is where the real change is happening. The Louisville-Nashville Railroad makes it into a true, almost a Midwestern city. And again, you have huge numbers of immigrants that are coming in and changing the situation. But in 1860, I don't find that those class divisions are especially salient in terms of this debate over slavery and union. There's a pretty strong agreement. Manifesting in different ways, different political traditions, but different partisan traditions, I should say. But I think it's pretty strong.
And certainly, as you mentioned earlier in this interview, this notion of the dual rebellion is obviously critical to your work, and rightly so. I found particularly interesting the elements talking about guerrillas. Obviously, certainly a very hot topic at the moment. Dan Sutherland's book that came out only just a couple of years ago, and there's a lot more coming down the pipeline. This idea, though, that guerrillas, by undertaking these actions to aid the Confederate cause, were really almost undermining their goals, was quite interesting. Is this something that we really need to view in a new light with future guerrilla historiography? Is this something that really people need to start to reassess and to really drive home?
I do, and I think that there's an irony to guerrilla war as an international phenomenon. Almost always, guerrillas are a socially reactionary force of a kind. But as they are sort of trying to undermine what they see as an illegitimate political order that's trying to usher some kind of change. And almost every time as they do that, in the chaos that they sow, it destroys, whatever the culture it was. I mean, you can see this in Iraq. You can see this in all around the world. So, in a sense, I think that kind of ironic undermining of the very system that they're trying to preserve is something that does happen quite often. Now, that said, I should mention that that obviously was not their intention, obviously, and in many cases, in fact, the guerrillas tried to almost ramp up their kind of slave patrolling activities. Diane Moody Burke, her recent work on slavery in Missouri, talks about, early on, many of the guerrillas, tried to, pay special attention to returning runaway slaves. But the thing is that didn't sustain itself, because ultimately they were more at war with other white people. They were more at war with the Unionist government, with federal militia, with federal army officials. And, these are the forces that are patrolling the highways and byways of the border. And so as they have disappeared, taken to the bush, as it were, to try to, in their own battle, slaves see that there's an initiative they can take. And in some ways, that vignette that I actually start off the entire book with about this guy named Jim Jackson, right, this notorious bushwhacker out of in Missouri, he is an explicitly racially motivated guy, more so than most of the other guerrillas there. And you can see this almost exterminationist impulse, where he sort of says they serve the slaves, who are now being freed, serve no purpose at all. We don't need them to go, serve on cotton plantations. We don't have cotton here. So they need to just get the heck out of here. And you see this almost like nihilism there. I mean, so the old order's gone. Well, let's just destroy all of it. And it's a really, I think it develops this incredible level of racial violence as they see the bitterness, as they see this old order collapsing. And of course, the now ex-slaves is having played a leading role in destroying that old order. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's true. I think there is something we need to think about guerrillas in general, and how their ideological ambitions and the consequences of their destructive nature of their actions, across our loggerheads. One final thing to mention in light of that was that a very common insult that conservative Unionists used to hurl against Confederate supporters was they called them practical abolitionists. They used that quite often. They would talk about the irony of how these secessionists, but in their radicalism, had undermined the very constitutional order, Union order, that had preserved slavery for so long. And so they essentially welcomed the abolitionists. They brought the Canada line to the Ohio River. They did, you know what I mean? They used this kind of language quite often about how the guerrillas were, not just guerrillas, the Confederacy in general, really, was by its rash. And of course, they were absolutely right about that. I mean, the slavery would not have disappeared by 1865 without the Civil War. So, but they're arguing that quite early. That they're saying, see, look what happens when you start, when you cause a rebellion. You're going to invite these, the real abolitionists are going to come down, and they're going to start messing with things, and it's going to be out of our control. And who knows what the consequences will be.
And just following up a little bit with these concepts of racial violence. It seems with guerrilla violence, regulator violence after the war, honor is playing a huge role in all of this. And that also crosses racial lines as well, with issues over black education and even the ability to testify in open court in a mixed-race trial. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit just about these notions of honor in this area.
Sure. I think the key, I think, is a gendered notion, particularly notions of masculinity. Masculinity in the community, those who are organized and armed, can defend themselves, have the right to be considered full and equal citizens. This is sort of a bedrock principle among whites for a very long time. And here you have African Americans making a claim to that, their service in the Army being their first sort of foray into it, at least openly. And, whites are offended by this. This is challenging their sort of right to be in charge over all social, political, economic elements of life. And they do see this as a threat, as a challenge to their honor. There's no doubt about it. The guerrillas are definitely motivated by, questions of, this whole, everything from the way guerrillas dress to the way they talk. Just everything about it it reeks of, again, this kind of very reactionary sense of masculinity and honor. And And again, when African Americans who are not considered to have any right to lay claims to these sorts of things, that they don't even have honor to preserve. And then you have these things like the test oath, loyalty oaths after the Civil War, where African Americans are able to testify. I mean, there's one interesting case in Missouri where a black woman actually testified and resulting in disfranchising essentially her former master. In a case in Missouri, there was a local state legislative race, and I called it the negative franchise. Where, I mean, as a black and as a woman, she's not going to have the right to vote, not until well in the 20th century. But by her testimony in this sort of zero-sum world of 1860s partisan politics, by her testifying to the rebel activities of not only her former master, but all these various people who paid him visits, that she was disfranchising them, and that was essentially empowering herself. So, and that was a massive affront to their honor.
Yeah, certainly. So finally, has there been a book of late, shifting gears a little bit, has there been a book of late that's really grabbed your attention that you'd like to recommend to our viewers at all?
Let's see. I mean, I certainly think one thing that's quite obvious, I think, is, of course, Foner's, won the Pulitzer for his fiery trial. And I also would be remiss if I didn't talk up my advisor, Stephanie McCurry's Confederate Reckoning, which is also wonderful. And I would suggest certainly Ann Marshall's book, Creating Confederate Kentucky, and Diane Moody Burke's about slavery in the Western Border. Stanley Harold's Border Wars is certainly, I think, a really important one. There's another book that will be coming out soon by Christopher Phillips. I believe that the working title is something like Where the Rivers Ran Backwards. It's sort of an overall history of the Ohio River Valley. And it's, again, it sort of covers this whole kind of heartland of the country. My thinking is sort of embedded in this kind of Upper South area. So I think those are probably some of the most important works. There was Mark Geiger's work, which is quite interesting. I actually served on a panel with him a couple of times. Actually, he's a very, very interesting guy. It was interesting because there were about 20 questions focused on him, and the rest of us were completely ignored. I guess I can see why. But those are the books that I suppose really come to mind. They tend to focus on that middle area, and I just think there's so little understood about it that it's certainly Stanley Harold's book, I think, is an important one.
Well, that certainly gives our viewers plenty to read.
Read,
Dr.
yeah.
Astor, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure.
I think Rebels on the Border, again, LSU Press, a phenomenal book for those of you out there. I highly recommend it, and really giving us a sense of some of the internal conflicts that are going on, that we need to really reassess how we look at this larger war, and to give us a little bit of a preview of what's going to happen after the war with issues of reconciliation in the rest of the country. So, Dr. Astor, thank you so much for joining us on Behind the Lines, and hopefully we can have you back on soon.
Thank you very much, David. I appreciate it.